Hey, Living North students, Mr. Davis, good morning. We are actually going to start Chapter 7, Psychological Disorders. So this is the first live stream to cover that information. So again, you have until Friday to complete Chapter 6 materials, and then and what we're going to start Chapter 7, Psychological Disorders today. And again, your notes will come from the live streams. So each day I'll be streaming 11 to 11:30, and I'll give you, and we'll take notes over the information. If you need clarification or anything explained, you can email me, contact me. You can also use the online text, okay? And then the Chapter 15 stuff is due the week after. So it's basically every 2 weeks. Is what kind of we're working for. We might actually have a little bit more time because it's kind of a big chapter. So I might actually move that back out a little bit. Okay. Now I noticed most of my Psych 2 students are not accessing the information, and I think there's going to be a lot of late assignments possibly. So, but again, everything you need is on Canvas. Read the survival guide that's posted on the announcements. Go to the assignment link. And I've got your Chapter 6 and your Chapter 7 assignments already on there. Actually, Chapter 7, I think I'm typing now, which I will link up. So yeah, so this is how you're going to get your information, and hopefully how you'll better understand it via the live chats. Okay, so we're going to start Chapter 7, which is psych disorders. Which is give you guys visual examples that you can actually see via videos. But also, you could just look up and Google any video on any disorder that we talk about. But today, before we actually get into the actual disorders, we're just going to talk about some basic intro stuff with psych disorders. And then I do have a doc on Canvas that I want you to look at, which basically is a resource guide. It has several links to adolescent mental health statistics, which again, we kind of went over, if you remember back to the signs of suicide presentation that we had to do in class and watch the video. I think you did it we did it with our first hour students, but I've got links on there from the CDC, WHO, National Institute of Mental Health. I mean, there's just a bunch of them, and you're gonna have to pick one and then basically look at the stats and then just write down five things that you learned or 5 interesting facts. Okay. And that'll go on your lab, or you're going to turn that in with your vocab assignment, which I'll have that on Canvas. Okay. All right. So before we start, this topic is also called abnormal psychology. So what we need to do is then define abnormal. So in psychology, what does it mean if behavior is abnormal? Okay. Well, we define that by qualifiers or characteristics. Number one, it deviates from the social norm. Okay. So it goes against society. It goes against culture. All right. It goes against what is portrayed or normalized in our society. Now, this obviously shows you the cultural influence on abnormal behavior, because the definitions can change for culture. Example, in the United States, we have a large personal bubble. We like our personal space. We don't like people invading that. Our bubble is probably one of the biggest in the world. We run into problems when we run into cultures who have a very small personal bubble, okay? Which again, we talked about with the coronavirus, which is why one of the reasons why Italy has been hit so hard is that they have very small personal bubbles. They have a lot of personal contact. They talk and interact with each other very, very closely. We would think that's abnormal in our country. That's not how people do it. If we constantly had people coming up to us very closely and we interacted that way, we would immediately feel, claustrophobic almost. Be like, you need to back up a little bit, and so it is very culture based. Okay, again, there are great examples. This is an extreme example, but there are cultures that value cannibalism as a part of ancestral worship. So there are cultures that dig up their dead every year on a holiday, and they dress them up and parade them around town. Okay, and that's part of how they worship them. Okay. Number 2. Okay, it is maladaptive. Maladaptive, right? And maladaptive basically means that they refuse to change. Okay, they know the behavior is, which we'll get into, is kind of self-defeating, but they just don't ever do anything to change it. Or they admit or they confess that they just are too weak to change it. Okay, but whatever the reason is, they don't change. They don't seek to better things, to get help. They just kind of stay stuck in this cycle of kind of painful behaviors. Okay. And number 3 with that would be self-distress. Okay. So the behavior causes me pain. It causes me personal pain. It's not something that's pleasurable to me. It puts me in a state of constant stress, anxiety, in distress. So it's bad for me. And it has adverse effects on me and my body. But again, I refuse to change. Okay. All right. Let's see, there's several of these. I'm going to figure out how many of these I want to give you. Let's go. Let's see here. What do I want to do? Deviates from social norm, maladaptive, personal distress. Which just causes pain. Okay, it harms socialization. So the abnormal behavior, again, we are social animals. We need to interact with other people. We need to have that socialization, and these behaviors keep us from doing that successfully and in a healthy way. So generally, with some abnormal behaviors, it causes people to isolate themselves, not to interact with others. So it's socially harmful. Now, that can go up into self-distress, but socialization is a huge part, culture, society, interacting with others, especially in psychology. So it's often kind of its own little category over there. And that's actually when the DSM diagnoses disorders, it actually lists its impact on behavior, its level of social malfunction, or how it affects us socially. Social impairment is what it calls it. It's its own little category. So one thing that we use to measure if somebody actually does have a disorder is, does it pretty much use, like when we talk about anxiety disorders, some of you have a very huge fear of an object or something. What's the difference between a fear and a phobia? Well, one of the big differences is the phobia does this. It takes you out of life. It massively negatively impacts your ability to keep your job, to socialize with people, and so on and so forth. Okay. I think I'll just stay there. We'll just keep with those 4. There's generally 5 to 7, but I think those are the big ones that we probably will just work on here in the class. So abnormal behavior. Some of the 4 qualifiers are: it deviates from the social norm. So as far as the United States goes and our culture goes, this would not be a normal thing that people would do. It's so I'll put distress, self-distress, but it also causes other people pain as well. And then harms socialization, which could be there too. So it impairs their social functioning, their day-to-day functioning. Okay. So I'm actually, that's what I'll do. I'll just do this one. Because these two are actually a little bit different. Because I could, if I work from home, I'm by myself, and I naturally should be by myself when I do my job, but I can't do my job. So, so besides harming socialization, my interaction and relationships with other people, it does hurt my day-to-day functioning. Just my day-to-day to do things, to live life. Okay. I'm gonna go get my notes, make sure I'm covering everything here. The next thing that we need to talk about is, let's see here. Yeah, what actually do we use to measure psychological disorders and actually to diagnose people? And that is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Okay, so DSM-5, which I have a book and I left it at school. I have a DSM-5. It's on my desk. It's the blue book if you've seen it. I also have the DSM-4. So what the medical community has created is a manual of all the psychological disorders and the diagnostic criteria to have them. Now, they all include these and many other qualifiers, okay? But in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and this is version 5, basically what we do is we classify thousands of psychiatrists, psychologists work on this, and they revise it every so often. And what they do is they add disorders, they take disorders out, they change diagnostic criteria, they add criteria. But for you to be diagnosed with a disorder, you have to fit the criteria in the manual. So no longer is it just up to the psychiatrist, psychologist, the physician to diagnose you with a disorder or even mental health issues. They have to go by the manual. So the manual tells you the number of symptoms you have to have, how intense they have to be, how often you have to have them, how dramatically the impact has to be on you, that type of thing. So when you see a psychiatrist, psychologist, they're going to reference the manual, and the manual describes the disorders, defines them, it lists symptoms, how many of the symptoms you have to have, how often you have to have them. It gives them the diagnostic criteria to make the diagnosis. Because we know in society, people walk around and you say, I have anxiety or I have depression, which is perfectly possible, but they don't have an anxiety disorder. They don't have a depressive disorder or a mood disorder. High levels of anxiety and even be treated for it. Counseling, therapy, medication, but I still won't have a disorder if it does not fit the criteria, okay? So that's kind of a little bit of a difference between mental illness and a psychological disorder. So if I have a psychological disorder, I have the medical diagnosis to fit the criteria for the disorder, which basically means that the anxiety or depression massively impacts my day-to-day functioning. Okay, all right, are we good there? So this is the manual used for diagnosing psychological disorders. Okay, next is the difference between psychotic versus neurotic. Okay, so generally all disorders can be characterized. The two big broad categories are they're either psychotic or with a break from reality. I no longer function in which I have a break from reality. So the big one in psychology is schizophrenia because it has hallucinations, delusions. We'll talk about that one and we'll watch examples of that one. But anytime I am not functioning in the here and the now, in the real present, I am not based in reality. And that would be a psychotic disorder. Okay. Everything else generally is neurotic. And neurotic means that it's based on an abnormal level of fear, neurosis. Okay. Now, neurotic is actually used as a personality term in psychology. That we believe that we all have a level of neuroticism in us, a level of anxiety. So obviously, this would be when the level of anxiety is very, very high. And it, again, both of these would have to fit the 5 qualifiers that we have up here, okay? So I can be neurotic, but it really not impact me in any of these 5 ways. Now, I can also be neurotic, in which it impacts me in all of those 5 ways. Okay. Psychotic generally does impact you in those 5 ways. So if I am psychotic or if I have psychosis, there's going to be some abnormal behavior, okay? It's going to fit the qualifiers. If I'm neurotic, I might actually be okay. But if the neurosis grows, if it becomes very overwhelming, then I'm gonna, and it starts having some of these 5 or 4, 5 impacts, then I'm gonna be in trouble. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So that's kind of just the intro here. Okay. So these are kind of just the notes. But then you're going to need to know mental health stats. Okay. So you're going to need to know, and you're going to need to know list 5. Okay. All right. So actually, this is where I'm going to want you to put those current stats. So in Canvas, as an announcement, I've got a doc that's called Chapter 7, Psych Disorders, Mental Health Statistics. And then I've got, when you open it, I've got links to all kinds of statistics on there. So you can just pick one link. You can do multiple links, but you need to find 5 current and relevant statistics and put those in your notes. Okay. And those will be on your quiz. All right. Now, what I'm hoping that you'll do is that you'll find relevant, interesting facts to you and your age group. And I think that's mainly what I've done is I presented resources and links to adolescent mental health statistics because I want you to be aware of how mental health impacts your age group, current mental health issue. And then the stats, obviously it'll break it up between just mental health issue and psychological disorder. Again, it's much more rare to have a psychological disorder. These are the serious illnesses in psychology, but we also deal with just different levels of mental illness, which would just be, I have anxiety to 19, some of them are it's like 17 to 25. But in that age group, we kind of have, if you will, an epidemic brewing in our country in that age group, and that more and more, statistically, more and more adolescents are having negative impacts of mental illness. And those statistics are very high, which is why, the state of Missouri has adopted the Signs of Suicide program, because suicide is linked to mental illness. It's greatly linked to several disorders, depression, okay, severe major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder. There are definitely some of the psych disorders that we're going to talk about that have a huge criteria of, relevant to this topic and to psychology. Because we've got to find some way to get a grip on this. Just like with the coronavirus, we've got to find some way to get a grip on this, study it, understand it, and try to prevent it from happening again and harming people. It's the same thing with some of these disorders, especially in your age group. They seem to kind of blow up. Now there's a variety of reasons of that, but I just wanted you to be aware of the relevancy it is to you and your age group now. Not only if you're struggling with it, if you know somebody who's struggling with it, but just be aware of how overwhelmingly the statistics show and support nationally by any institution you want to look at in there that, this is something that your age group needs to pay attention to. Okay. So today, the criteria for abnormal behavior in the United States. Know the DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 for mental disorders. This is how we diagnose, categorize, catalog disorders. Know that all disorders are either psychotic or neurotic. Know the difference between the two. Maybe even be able to come up with an example of each, which I will talk about once we start going through them. And then you need to list 5 relevant mental health statistics, okay, for adolescents, okay, which again is on that doc. So just go to any of those and pick 5 statistics that you think are interesting, or the first 5 that come that you see, or whatever, and write those down in your notes, okay? And then we will be taking notes starting tomorrow. We'll talk about anxiety disorders first, but we will be taking notes with a chart, okay, which will be a lab that you're going to turn in, which I referenced before, and I'll get on there. So you're going to actually take a picture of the chart of the notes. So you're actually, this chapter, you're going to kind of turn in your notes a little bit over the disorders, okay, in which we categorize them. So that'll be a lab that you're actually going to turn in as well. And I'll have it up here and we'll fill it out together. And then if you miss the live streams, you can obviously go back and get it. Okay. All right. But for today, Monday, March 30th, these are the notes that you need to have today. This is the stuff that you will be quizzed over. Don't forget, you can use your notes on the quiz when I get that up there. And again, this quiz will be off. I think you have till April 10th or the 13th to get that done. And we might push that back because I don't know if we'll be able to get through the notes that long. But anyway, I'll have a temporary date on there now. Also, at the same time, you need to be working on chapter 6, stress and health. Okay, that's due this Friday. So make sure that you have, we finished notes before spring break. So just make sure you have your in-class vocab turned in, assignment, your 8 terms from the list on Canvas, that you have your project done, which is on Canvas, turned in, and then I will post the quiz probably today, hopefully, or tomorrow. Okay. All right. Hope anybody want to chat, a live chat, a question, or are we good? Anybody with a question? Okay. All right. Have a good one.